Let's look at another story, though, involving politics and football, a bit closer to home, because there's an interesting report out this week revealing that senior members of the British government's Foreign Office have requested information on Man City's financial battle with the Premier League, as has the British Embassy in Dubai. Stefan, I'll start with you. What's your initial reaction to this?
I think very understandable that would be the case. We've spoken before about the scale and the seriousness of the allegations that are made in terms of City, the various local sponsors in the United Arab Emirates, and a number of individuals who are involved in the government of the UAE. So it is not a surprise that the embassy wants to be kept abreast of developments, because a finding by the Premier League's Independent Commission against City will naturally make the case against those individuals and those companies. So it would be very serious from a diplomatic perspective if the Independent Commission found against City. But what I think it does also confirm is that those lines are quite, and those walls, those information barriers between the Premier League, the government, and other parties are actually quite strong. And the embassy clearly has not been in the loop, either from the British government or from the local UAE government. So, I think it's understandable. But I think it also does reinforce the independence of the process that's ongoing.
Ben, is that a bit of a surprise, as Stefan says there, that it feels as if, the government have been kept out of the loop until this moment?
It'd be more worrying if they were kept in the loop, because this is supposed to be an independent process. And what we've noted from the Freedom of Information Act requested by the Times is two things. Number one, can there be a one-pager updating on the situation? And number two, what are the key lines? Now, key lines are effectively more what you may brief, either within meetings or eventually to media. And those key lines essentially say that it's nothing to do with the government or the Foreign Office, and therefore all you're going to get is basically that the Premier League has its own process, it's independent of government, and when it runs its due course, we'll find out what the verdict is. And also it will be published, and the expectation is that will be next year. So there's nothing untoward with that, nor is there anything particularly atypical about a back and forth to try and get the updates. But the one pager has a little bit more of a grey area, because if that is provided, does it, for example, give any insight or any type of head start for the government to then react or potentially get involved? Now, in this case, there's no implication that that one-pager was even provided. But what we need to make sure, especially with an independent football regulator also coming in the future, is if the Premier League can self-govern, and if this independent panel is also separate from the Premier League because they're referring the charges to it, it has to be able to run its full course privately without the government getting a head start, because that's when you start to wonder whether there can be any kind of influence. And we've had this back and forth with the government getting involved in the Newcastle United takeover, despite Boris Johnson saying that they were not involved. And now we have further correspondence, two lots, in fact, also asking for an update on the Manchester City case. So I think you would expect the government to want to know what's going on, but actually all signs suggest that the Premier League and its independent panel ultimately have not engaged, and therefore the government are as in the dark as we are at this stage.
Stefan, Ben brings up that Newcastle example there. We've also got this situation as well. Do you think that it's fair that the government should have a right to know what is going on in these cases to an extent, or do you actually think that these should be independent of themselves, and actually the government to an extent should be kept in the dark?
Certainly in relation to the City situation, there will be very serious consequences if the Independent Commission found against City and therefore made out those allegations against nationals from one of our main trading partners in the UAE.
Do you go along with what Ben's saying, though, that actually this would be the job of an incoming independent regulator?
Well, it's outside of the remit of the regulator, in fact. So part of
So that wouldn't solve this kind of situation then?
Not really. I mean, part of the change that came in with the latest set of rules in relation to the regulator was to remove the element of consideration of who the trading relations with a potential buyer. Okay, so that is now outside of the remit on that side. But it's not going to deal with the Manchester City situation or a regulatory investigation. The independent football regulator is not going to get involved in the day-to-day running of the Premier League in this way, or the financial regulation of the Premier League. And in any event, overlaid on all of this stuff is going to be political reality. So even though it's been removed from the remit of the independent regulator to specifically consider the trading implications of what a takeover might look like for one of our trading partners, I can guarantee you that if it happens again with another nation that is a key partner, those conversations will take place at the highest levels, regardless of whether it's within the remit of the independent regulator or not, because it's political and commercial reality.
Ben, do you think that there's a world where it should be under the remit of an independent regulator coming in, or is Stefan correct in the sense that actually it's just going to have to be something that they leave for the clubs and the Premier League to decide themselves?
Well, not necessarily in the context of this case. It's more that if you take a step back, the independent regulator will have remit and say over who comes into a football club in the first place. And as a result, we may not get a repeat of certain owners or certain scenarios because the independent regulator may take a different view over who is fit or unfit to, one, come into a football club, or two, when they are embedded in that football club, whether or not anything changes. And it's that extra layer of separation. So at the heart of this is not necessarily a link between the 115 charges case and the independent football regulator. It's more just the Premier League at the moment have a necessity to show that they can self-govern and self-regulate. And every single time that their transparency is called into question or their process is accused of being slow or flawed, the independent regulator hovering provides a debate and puts extra pressure almost on the Premier League in order to maintain their position of power. Because make no mistake, the Premier League will have to accept the independent football regulator, but they'd rather that it doesn't exist because they want to run a league without any kind of challenge. They want to make the maximum amount of marketing money. And in addition to that, they want to self-govern and they want to self-regulate. And the independent regulator will change that dynamic. So every single time the Premier League is now in the public eye, it puts a question mark over whether their own structure, whether their own process is right going forwards. And that's why, for example, if we were to find out, and there's no suggestion of this at this stage, that the Premier League were backhanding information to the government or giving them a head start or ceding to a government position because it's better for international relations, regardless of what the football decision is. If any of that ever happened, then again, you come back to, is the Premier League genuinely capable of transparently self-governing? And that's why these cases are important, even though it's true what Stefan says. The regulator can't just come in and take over like for like, but there's still that link because the Premier League now know that there's scrutiny and new scrutiny coming from outside.
Well, just to build on that, I think one of the biggest fears that the Premier League has had about the regulator has been about mission creep. And I think that link that Ben talks about is a pertinent point, because I think the fear will be that whilst the remit will be the remit on day one, what does the remit look like going forward? And if the more issues that are not dealt with in a visibly satisfactory manner by the Premier League and its processes, the more risk that there is that a government down the line adds to the remit of the regulator once it's set up, once it's got that kind of infrastructure and leadership structure around it. Then the fear will be that other things get bolted on to the remit of the regulator. And the big fear, I think...
Who provides that remit as well?
Well, it will be government-led ultimately in terms of things that are added later on to the remit. I think the remit is the remit on day one. So in the bill that's going through Parliament now, that will broadly set out the remit of the regulator. That will then be entrenched within an actual body and with an actual team and with resources and with funding. And the funding is going to be important because right now, there's no possibility that even if everybody wanted to, that a independent football regulator could deal with financial regulation of the Premier League or even broader financial regulation of the entire 92 clubs. It would be impossible because the infrastructure required to do that, both from a financial and also from a legal perspective, would simply be too grand a job and would cost too much. And we know, we talked about the £50 million that the Premier League spent just on its legal cases last year. That's on top of its internal costs. We know that this is an enormously expensive process just in terms of the Premier League teams. So if you were to try and add in, all of the clubs with all of the complexity and all the differences in each of the clubs, that would be an enormous challenge. So ultimately, they want to get it set up. They want to give it a fairly limited remit actually on day one, despite the changes that have been made by the Labour government, that it's a fairly limited remit on day one. But the fear, as I say, from the Premier League is if they don't get their house in order, their fear will be that over time, those political issues around regulation will be passed to a regulator. And the more that the regulator has control of those issues, the bigger an issue it is for the Premier League itself.
Do you feel that the challenge is too enormous, too complex for them to get their house in order?
Yeah, well, no, I think the Premier League right now is the best place to manage its regulation, in my view. It's the best funded organisation. It's got the most power in respect of its own clubs, and therefore it is well placed, providing the rules are set out correctly and providing it's acting appropriately in terms of its leadership and its regulation. I think the Premier League is the best place for it. But they have to be wary of a perception that they're failing to do that, because that perception will ultimately end up being a driver for people to move it over to a regulator. And that's the worst case scenario for the Premier League, because what then happens is it loses control of its own regulation. There'll be issues with FIFA and there'll be issues with UEFA, but if it becomes a political issue, there's real risk there for the Premier League.
Gents, if we stick with Manchester City just for a moment, there have been reports this week suggesting that a number of Premier League clubs will look to seek compensation should Man City be found guilty of their 115 charges. Ben, I'll start with you because we saw Jose Mourinho joke a couple of weeks ago about getting a retrospective medal for coming second to Manchester City when he was Manchester United manager. He also joked about getting compensation as well for that. In terms of the compensation that a number of clubs may be seeking here, how much are we potentially talking, and do you think that it might be a possibility?
I think the amount we're talking won't be known until we know the severity of the charges, but collective action is very possible. I think that we've seen this before in the case, for example, of Everton or even Nottingham Forest, where the teams that went down said, hang on a minute, we wouldn't have gone down if that punishment had been given earlier and if a guilty side stayed in the Premier League. The ones that went down, it was basically collective action between teams like Leeds and Leicester City and Southampton. They were all able to gang up and say there might be a way of seeking compensation. So there is a very realistic chance that if Manchester City are punished, it will open the door for some kind of collective action. In addition to that, you may see a shifting of honours, as Jose Mourinho joked about in that season when Manchester United under Mourinho finished second. Mourinho had said that was one of his best achievements as a manager. So we're going to have to wait and see. The hearing itself could finish as early as mid-November, but the actual decision will not be known in the public domain until early next year. And then we'll start to understand the severity. And the reason why I say caution is needed, and that also extends, therefore, to potential compensation and who may challenge Manchester City and the Premier League over what, is because these 115 charges are seen as one by one by one. And most people from the outside in look at the number and instantly believe that even if they prove 1, 2, 3, 4, there's going to be a very big punishment. But you should more look at the charges as grouped into, I believe it's 5 categories. And one of those categories is non-cooperation, and Manchester City simply haven't cooperated. So they're likely to get some kind of sanction for that. And most of the other charges fall under 4 categories, which means that if Manchester City are able to prove innocence in a category, you might find that it is a repeat charge season on season on season. So a lot of charges drop off. And that's why we have to wait and see how many categories, not just specifically charges, Man City are found guilty of before we understand the magnitude of the punishment. But of course, were they to be found guilty, and they vociferously deny any guilt at this stage, then every single club in the Premier League is going to be looking at, did they take a trophy off us? Did they take extra prize money or television money off us? And then if you look at it a bit deeper, what if you were a team that went down by 3 points and you lost twice to Manchester City in that season? Could you then say, we want that back? Could you then say somebody else beat Man City and those 3 points could be rescinded? So this isn't just a case of Jose Mourinho and Manchester United in second, supplanting Manchester City in first. This is a case of everybody in every season, if Manchester City are found guilty, redoing the table, removing the Manchester City equation, and then you might find the top 6 is different, the bottom 3 is different, and if you were impacted, there will be a door open to try and sue either individually or collectively for damages.
This also brings me on to another question, and I want to put this to you, Stefan, as well, because obviously, hypothetically, the retrospective silverware for these clubs may not even be something that they want because they won't feel like they've properly achieved it, given that Man City on the day were the ones that picked up the trophy and won it. But the other question is the inner workings of the club as well, because, you know, let's say there were player bonuses for winning a league title. Now, if these retrospective retrospective trophies are given out, you know, what do clubs do? Let's say there were Liverpool players that maybe would have got a bonus for winning the title, Man United players as well, staff members too. How would clubs work that out if that were to happen?
A lot of what Ben went through is accurate in that you can't look at it in terms of 115 charges. You look at it in buckets and causes of action as it will be. And you'll also look at the materiality of those things that are, if they are proven against City, that are proven. This is a deeply complex issue if it was to occur. So I think it's even beyond whether trophies are reallocated. There is clearly an issue if the charges are proven on the most serious matters in respect to City. There is definitely an impact of some scale against other teams, and therefore it will also be an impact over a number of years. Now, exactly what that impact is from a financial perspective is really, really hard to assess, certainly now, but even for the processes that are in place to do it. Now, if you look at the situation with Everton, we know from the Everton decision, the first independent commission decision, that a number of clubs, as Ben mentioned, had, under the Premier League rules, applied to the independent commission for potential compensation should the finding go against Everton. We don't currently know whether anything came of those claims, and we may never know. It may have been that they were all dropped, it may have been that they were all successful, we just don't know. But within the Premier League rules are two things. One, the clubs can't sue each other in the courts. So the idea that this can go off and be a series of high court claims, club versus club, is not going to happen. There are then two routes. Either it can be dealt with by the independent commission under their powers, and under their powers they have potential to offer unlimited compensation to affected clubs, third parties, or alternatively it can be dealt with through an arbitration process, a separate arbitration process. Now, it is likely that the big issue that the clubs are going to have, anybody that tries to make a claim against City, is going to be on causation, i.e. did those things that are proven against City cause a loss? And if they did, what was the scale of that loss? And then just to complicate it further, under English law, there is a concept of a loss of a chance. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that it was certain that but for City's breach, a team would have won the league. It could have been that they might have won the league, or that they had a 20% chance of winning the league. And that can also give rise to a compensation claim. The point I'm trying to make is it's incredibly complicated in terms of knowing exactly how this will pan out. And really, the key thing that would be a concern for me in terms of the regulation of the entire game and the issue is just the number of clubs that are involved. So over 9 years, you've probably got, I don't know, let's say 35 teams were in the Premier League over the time. I don't know how many teams were relegated, but let's say there's 30, 35 teams. All of them may have a claim for at least one position in the league. Well, one position in the league is still £2 million. So you may have numerous teams with numerous claims, with numerous causes of action in respect of that claim.
And just for clarity, it would be Manchester City asked to stump up that bill?
I think
for each team?
Yeah, I think if these claims were proven against City, then it would be City who would be liable ultimately for the compensation, providing that the process and the causation was proved as well as loss. So it's a complicated process to get to that point, and of course there'll be appeals and there'll be all sorts of submission made in respect of each club. It's very hard to see how an independent commission or even arbitration panels, multiple arbitration panels, can deal with such complexity. But that's what they'll have to do under the rules if the most serious charges are proven against City. And of course, it remains a big if.
It's really interesting, that point of causation as well, because when you look at how close some of those title races in particular were, I think especially with Liverpool as well, essentially what you're saying is the closer that they were to Manchester City, the better their case will be. But also I want to ask you about those other clubs that Ben mentioned, the ones that say, well, we lost twice to Man City that season, we missed out on staying in the league by 6 points. Yeah. Are you saying that because of where Man City were as a club, they will have more chance of arguing, well, hold on, you weren't going to come to the Etihad anyway and get 3 points, so we're not going to pay you a compensation?
Well, look, we don't know. So it's incredibly complicated. First of all, we don't know what the findings are going to be. But, if we're talking about the sorts of wholesale breaches that are alleged over a number of years, the implication is likely to be very serious in terms of the assessment of the Independent Commission on the impact that it made in a sporting sense. So I would expect that if the Independent Commission found against City, it is likely to make some pretty firm statements that City had had some pretty major sporting advantages over the period of the allegation. And that's, again, I must be clear, that's if proven from the material side of things. But if that is the case, then all of these sorts of factors that you're talking about could well come into play. So it may well be that a smaller team or even a bigger team says, well, if City had not breached in that way, then maybe X, Y and Z would have happened. And if X, Y and Z would have happened, then the consequences may have been something different to what actually occurred. Now, it will likely be very difficult for those clubs to prove each of those elements. But that doesn't mean that people won't try, and it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a long hearing that's going to have to assess the submissions in respect of each of these cases and decide whether actually there is causation and whether there is loss. So it's an enormously complicated situation in the event that there is a finding against City. And of course, we also have to be aware that any independent commission is probably going to be subject to an appeal. And then we'll also have to see what the appeal says, just for a bit of added complexity to the situation.
Yeah, well, it will certainly keep us in a job, won't it, for a long time.
It will keep the lawyers in a job, that's for sure.
It will indeed. Plenty of ifs and buts at the moment. We'll see how the case plays out.